Marianne, do you
Yeah.
want to talk about your experiences? Just so I know what's fair game.
I'm fine to talk about anything. I'm in Al-Anon, which is like the Allies of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah.
So
Or girlfriends.
yeah, pretty much. Right. So it's like people always think it's AA and it's not. And then you have to explain that it's not AA. It's very confusing. But yeah, I mean, I would like to talk about part of my experiences there, especially if we talk about whether addiction's a disease or not, or what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm interested in that.
That's where I would hope this would go. Yeah.
Hi, welcome to Smooth Brain. This is an informal neuroscience podcast that we created to fill the void coronavirus has created in our research communities, which is basically spontaneous communication. We don't bump into each other in the hallways anymore. We don't go to conferences in person anymore. There's no like late night bar talk. You can't like spitball ideas with anybody in the way that we used to. So here we discuss current theories as well as classic research, and then we connect it to our actual lives. It's like non-professional and totally laid back. Today we're going to be discussing new ideas that Aaron has that have really interesting implications for how we conceptualize and study addiction in the lab. Briefly, I'm just going to introduce our guest and myself, and then we'll get into it. Aaron is a former friend. No, he's a current friend and former
News
colleague.
to me. This is a way to break it.
Wow.
Oh. The opposite of an intervention.
Is this because I wrote notes to help me with the intro?
Yeah.
Yeah, my earliest memory of meeting you is I was an undergraduate in Liz Phelps's lab, and you were at one of her lab meetings, and you asked a question. I don't remember what you asked, but I was like, oh, this guy is really smart. And it's true. I've come to learn you are actually very smart. I'm always learning from your work. I'm really excited about your new papers. Yeah, so you're a faculty member now at UC Irvine studying reinforcement learning and memory. You want to make it completely clear that you're not an addiction scientist, but would like to move maybe in that direction. And then Brace is also a current friend and former heroin addict, as well as a successful podcaster. And you have a lot of firsthand experience with what it's like to grapple with addiction and also to recover. So I'm like really excited to see how these like lab grown theories resonate with your actual experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Marianne. I'm a cognitive and social neuroscientist. I'm a postdoc at Stanford. Yeah, do you guys want to fill in the blanks there? Anything I missed on intros?
I can give a little background about my use of drugs too. I use them frequently and fervently for a long time. I was like a pillhead throughout my like late teenage years. Then I injected heroin. Well, I did heroin all sorts of ways, but I settled on injecting it for like I don't know. It's a little hazy because a bunch of stuff happened, but for about 3 years, and I was also a daily user of methamphetamine for the last year too, alongside it.
Cool. Those are both going to come up in this conversation for sure. I'm really curious on the differences, if like your experience of addiction with either one feels different, like because they're very different chemicals.
Yeah. This is one of the many questions I have.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Do we want to start there, or do you want to?
Sure, I can answer that.
Yeah. Tell us about yourself. So I'm genuinely interested. Like, if you have an idea in your mind of how it is that you became an addict.
Yeah, well, it's actually pretty easy to identify for me. Is that I felt a lot of times like I had a pit in my stomach, like a sort of anxious feeling, and just like a general sense of discomfort every day, all day. And once I discovered Oxycontin, or it was, I mean, I think Vicodin before that, although Oxycontin's really when it took off. I realized that all those like bad thoughts I had, all like or like bad feelings that I had, and the general sense of discomfort and unease, like immediately went away. And I could do stuff like clean my room and, sort of how these that go out and be like sort of outgoing and feel comfortable. And I mean, that's a common experience I hear from a lot of people who start using like, pills and stuff. It's actually more social rather than like getting, withdrawing in your room, not withdrawing from pills, but, isolating your room, doing whatever. And so I basically took it because I thought I could function like a normal person, on drugs.
That makes sense with stuff I read in your paper, Aaron, where you're saying like the reason why maybe people relapse or like continue to experience addiction even after they've had the negative consequences is because the initial experience is usually tied to really positive social behaviors.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. That is every addict will tell you that like you don't remember any of the times that like you injected like fake heroin with Gatorade or like any shit like that. You always remember the initial like your initial experiences, which are usually extremely positive. And even like years and years and years down the road. I mean, I've heard this from, this is what people think, like years, like you don't remember any of the withdrawals or like the the bad experiences with it. I mean, you remember them, but you don't have, there's a feeling that you get when you think of when you first started using it, like that. It's like it's almost a physical feeling that sort of mimics like cravings or something like that, where it's like it's like a positive thing. You get like I don't know, there's a real draw to that. Like there's like a through line from your first experiences using to wherever you are now, that sort of just like glides over even years and years and years of bad experiences, and that doesn't like go away like that. If I was going to go use right now, I would be thinking of it in terms of how I first started using rather than when I finished using or the majority of my using.
Yeah.
No, so that's exactly where I was going with this next is how do you not use?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky in the sense that I'm a heroin addict and it's less in your face. I mean, depending on what street you're on, than like drinking. Like alcoholics, I think have it a lot tougher. But I mean, I go to AA meetings, and I basically structure my life differently. And I've worked a lot on like the reasons that I did start using in the first place. But heroin also, in it, it had a really bad effect on my life. It was like an atom bomb that kind of obliterated everything. And so I have like also that experience behind me as well. But mostly through like just constantly working on it and not letting it sort of like the memory of the bad stuff fade in a way. Like I have to remind myself of it and help other people who are like going through the same thing or maybe recently emerged from that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, that also ties to your paper, Aaron, right? Because one of the things you propose is that like recovery or like treatment should try to increase the strength of the connection between the drug and the association with the negative consequences versus the positive one.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's necessarily, an association with negative consequences per se, right? Maybe that's just a personality thing. I'm not interested in like, installing a disciplinarian inside everyone's head, but more the sort of like something that I hear often. So one thing, when you tell people that you have written a paper about addiction, everyone who has ever been anything remotely like an addict will tell you all of their stories. And so I've heard a lot of this now. And one of the things that I hear from people who have sort of, crossed that sort of 5-year horizon, where it's now considered to be like, likely, no more likely than the general population, is that they have associated these early experiences with, they think about them, they never go away, right? Sometimes it's really nice to remember them, but they also think about the things that they need to do or want to do, or the life they have now in ways that are incompatible. Sometimes they had a kid, sometimes it's a job, sometimes it's like mountain climbing, something like that. It's just like, it's just not going to work with whatever was going on before. And it's so much more instrumental and I think less dramatic than it's you might
What do
think
you
if you didn't come into it that way.
what do you mean by the 5-year? Like, what happens after 5 years?
That just like epidemiologically, right? There's this
Uh-huh.
this idea that like after 5 years of being in recovery, you're back down at what is it, like 15% chance of having some kind of, falling into some kind of clinical addiction, which is the general population
Yeah.
percentage in the United States, right?
Oh.
So there's those the early time, far better than I, right? But my understanding is that the early time, the first week, the first year, the first 2 years, things are a bit more volatile, right? And
Yeah.
the statistic from NIDA that I saw is something like 60% of people who go into recovery end up relapsing within the first year, right? So things are much more volatile at that point.
Yeah, I remember being in like rehab and stuff, and some guy being like, statistically, like 2 of us are going to be sober in like a few months.
Yeah.
Which turned out to be true for that
Yeah.
for that crop of people. But yeah, I mean, certainly there's a high rate of recidivism at those places.
Yeah. So I have a question there. What do you use as a marker of success? Like, so being sober is maybe just one of many, or
For me,
yeah, I guess, or yeah.
oh, yeah. Or in general, well, for me, I mean, obviously being sober, yes. It's weird because it's difficult. Like that statistics on AA and stuff never made, like, I think about it sometimes. I think the metrics that they use are like to judge whether the like AA or any sort of sobriety program, rehabs or whatever, work is a binary whether you're sober or not. And I think that like I think that there's a little more gray area for some people in that, you know what I mean? For me, I am a heroin addict. I love heroin more than any. Like, if you get me on heroin, that's it, baby. Like, it's done. I'm going to be doing that for as long as I can. I'm going to run that train to the end. And so I can't fuck around or like, or do anything, remotely that could get me into that. And so I would judge it, but yeah, whether I'm sober and whether I'm like happy, I guess. And like, and that's not, I don't know. It's difficult to judge, but obviously like sobriety. No, I never really thought about this before. Yeah. And also cravings and like how much I think about it. I used to think about heroin constantly for like a while after I got sober. And it used to be a really appealing thing to me. And I would have this thought in the back of my head that I could do it again someday, even if it was like, these stupid reveries of like, I'll be like 65 and like, I can kind of just let go.
Little Miss Sunshine.
I'd never seen it, but I'm sure. I
Okay.
mean, I mean, that actually tracks the experience of some old people I know. Like, I know old people who basically just take opiates all day. And now that is no longer appealing to me. And there isn't like a little voice in the back of my head being like, you can do heroin again. There sometimes is a voice in the back of my head saying that I should drink someday. I'm not sure that'll ever go away. I don't even really like drinking. But I think it's more just like, once you stop drinking, a lot of social avenues sort of close themselves off to you. And it's a pretty radical restructuring of your life, more so than I think heroin, because it drinking is normal and heroin use is abnormal. And so when you stop doing heroin, you can re-enter normal society, but normal society is also a very, alcohol heavy thing. And so, there is a voice in the back of my head telling me I can drink someday. I'm aware of that, and it's like, I have peace with that. There's nothing I can do about it. I just know that what'll happen probably, or possibly, if I do it. And so, yeah, I guess maintaining where I am now emotionally and in terms of sobriety and trying to get better or whatever, but that to me is successful.
What about the pit you said that was in your stomach?
Yeah, I've just always, like, since I was about 12 years old, so not always, but I had like I don't know, like a ball of anxiety in my stomach that I don't know if it's anxiety. I don't know what it is, but it was like a sort of like a hole or something. And actually, you hear people talk about it in AA. They call it a God-shaped hole, which I think is just unforgivably corny.
It makes sense though.
It does make sense in the context, but it's, I mean, that's, I have like a hole in my, like, I felt, had a lot of gravity to it, a lot of gravitational pull to it. And I couldn't figure out for the life of me what to do about it. And so with, as time went on, I mean, I wasn't, it's not like I was like a real anxious shut-in or anything. I was a very social guy, did well in some things that I attempted to do, not very high in terms of ambition, I think, in general. But once I discovered opiates, I was like, I could do anything. It made me feel like I basically felt not normal. And then drugs, I realized, made me feel what I thought normal people felt like.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I have that whole, I think, too, that resonates a lot with me. And yeah, so my progression through 12 steps, I've wondered like how universal that whole actually is, because there's such a variety of 12-step programs that work on many different like problematic aspects of people's lives. And so much of those problems seem to be like, what do you do with this big void that's inside?
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, I think most of life is finding a way to deal with that. I think a lot of people are very successful at avoiding the existence of it. You can become like a workaholic or whatever. And then through the 12 steps, I feel like you find ways to fill it up.
Yeah.
And that seems
So
more lasting. Yeah.
what is the view within 12 steps or with other people you've spoken to about the prevalence of this whole outside of the recovery community?
The prevalence of like
how like
that feeling,
this void in like other people that aren't in recovery. It's difficult to, I mean, I would say that probably everybody has it in some form or another, because you can call it a bunch. I mean, we live in a society that is just horrifically alienating, and like,
That's exactly the word. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People are fucking insane in this goddamn country. I can't speak to anywhere else, but I don't know if it manifests itself in the same way for everybody, but I think there is this sort of sickness that's not natural. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think this is like necessarily a natural, it's a social phenomenon. But I think a lot of people have this sort of hole in them. It just, sometimes people, it doesn't affect them, or they, or it does affect them and they just don't use, drugs or alcohol to deal with it. But yeah, that's sort of my view. And I don't know about you, Marianne.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with me. I do think it comes from alienation. So maybe I'll piece out a couple of thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about how like the modern rejection of religion has like increased this whole, not necessarily just because religion forced people to go into this sort of communal traditional celebration thing that then I think didn't have that kind of structure after religion was sort of, lost amongst like modern people. So I think about that, and then like we are a social species, right? And so like a lot of the stuff that we've talked about on like previous episodes here and stuff that comes up in my research is like social isolationism is a very seriously acute, awful state to be in. And like the depths of it are like it's universal across all mammals. I wonder how many animals actually experience this stuff, but basically like for any social species, if you are isolated, you have a danger signal come up, because when you're isolated, you're vulnerable to predation and stuff. So like you're supposed to be in a group. So if you like, you see extreme changes in socially isolated animals where actually their immune system drops, like it looks like depression, there's increased sickness behaviors. It just, people lose, like animals lose motivation, people lose motivation to exist pretty much, right? And the 12 steps come in and they allow you to reconceptualize a lot of things. like it brings in community because you're engaging in this in a group, right? You have a special relationship with your sponsor. So you have someone that you work very personally close with that's invested in your growth. But then like the concept of like the higher power, whatever that is like that you're part of something greater than yourself. And that's what I think adds the extra layer of like, you're not just like, now you're not just socially isolated, because you could be a part of a group and still not feel whole and connected. But when you feel like you have some sort of a meaning, like that there is something beyond who you are that's a part of it, there's a lot more value to live for. And that value, I think, if you really like remind yourself of it, trumps pretty much any vice that can come up.
Well, I think that also, I mean, not to get too off topic here, I think that the upsurge and appeal of this sort of like vulgar, actually I don't know if that's the correct way to put it, but as a sort of like simplistic nationalism that you see in a lot of places. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you see it especially in like former you know, Eastern Bloc states, and now in America too, I think is an outgrowth of that too, because I think that people don't have anything that they feel they're a part of.
Mhm.
And there is no greater good for a lot of people. You know, even if you're like contributing to society here, like I think most people at their core know that they're not contributing to anything good, let alone a greater good.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, for me, I think AA appeals to a lot of people, because where else can you go? I mean, there's that whole thing, like what's that, bowling for one or whatever, that whole like theory,
Bowling alone.
Yeah,
bowling
Bowling Alone. I remember that.
but like I think that, you know, I think that is, I never read the book, but I kind of get the premise, is that you know, with AA, there's nowhere else that I can go where there's just like a bunch of other people there that like basically exist to be in like a social relationship with you. And it isn't based around drinking or anything like that. Like this is like, you can go no matter who you are, or, you know, what's going on with you. You know, you don't have to, like, I mean, there's obviously like, you can go to the, you know, nerd store and play Magic the Gathering with strangers or whatever. I'm literally struggling to think of anything else that people do where they just meet strangers and hang out with them. But I think the most important thing that AA provides for a lot of people is literally just people to hang out with that like are not that like, yeah, like it's just a social environment.
Yeah. I think it also helps to get rid of shame. And I think shame is like something that deepens people's isolation, like in the sense of attitudes. And it can also deepen your isolation if like your attitude of shame causes you to further your withdrawal from society, you know. Yeah.
But Aaron, can I ask you a question?
Please.
So so I have not read the paper, which I probably should have.
No, it's okay.
But
I'll wait. Like, you know, we can sit here and
yeah,
wait.
yeah.
Shit
Well, how
about
long
Staten
is
Island.
it? But like, what is your sort of thesis here? I don't know if I'm using the correct paper type term.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different places to start from here. I think I'm glad that you both sort of talked about your experiences first, because I think it gives me a lot of material. It echoes a lot of, I think, the things that were said in the paper, which is good. But I'll just kind of like maybe start from the nerdy beginning, and then you can chop out whatever works, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, like I said, I'm not an addiction scientist, right? Sort of, I came into this because I study decision making, and I'm in particular interested in sort of a move away from this sort of classical model of decision making that have been dominating the field for the last several decades, right? So those models are that they're sort of driven by this economics-based understanding, this like a neoclassical economics-based understanding, which is that in order to make a decision, what you do is you see the options that are in front of you. Like, let's say you're choosing between an apple and an orange, and you assess your internal value, your utils, what the utility is going to be of each of those options, right? So let's say, you know, six utils for an apple, 5 utils for an orange. So I'm likely to choose the apple, but maybe sometimes I'll get a little exploratory and freaky and choose the orange, right? You know, so there's a little bit of allowance for noise there, but that's basically it, right? learn via repeated experience what the value of that the options are, and then you make your choice in a utility maximizing way. And anything that isn't utility maximizing on the surface must be understood to be utility maximizing via some other transformation, right? So for instance, like intertemporal choice. There's a couple of great examples from this book that I'm going to mention, but I'm reading this book called Righteous Dope Fiend right now, which is about, have you read it?
Who's that about? Or who's that by?
I forget the names of the authors, to be honest. There's a photographer and I believe a sociologist.
It's about the people underneath the overpass.
I think it's south side of Potrero Hill, but they don't actually say
I read that book when I was like 18.
Oh, really?
I have it still. But that's funny because that was actually one of my first exposures to heroin addicts. Like reading about it was that book.
Yeah. So there's this really gut-wrenching scene in it where Hank, one of the characters, is essentially helping Caltrans clean up his site, knowing that it's basically prepping for an eviction, and that eviction is going to completely disrupt his livelihood beginning basically the next day. But he's like, hey, I get $20, that means I can get my bag, right? And so from an economist's perspective, his bag of heroin, from an economist's perspective, they would instantly say, well, that person has, incredibly steep discounting, right? They just discount the future. That's really just another way of describing the behavior, right? It doesn't actually tell us anything about what's going on. And so I'm really interested in sort of like mechanistically, like at the cognitive neural operations level, what's going on there that leads to that kind of decision. And is it really helpful to think about it in terms of utility maximization, or are there sort of other things going on there? And so that sort of decision, I mean, that's not where we began for doing this. So, applying it to addiction came later, but that sort of approach to decision making kind of falls apart. That's like, learning from repeated experience and comparing things based on utility. When you start talking about these sort of like more flexible, kind of like goal-directed, highly motivated, creative behaviors where people can do things that they've never done before, or that maybe they've only had like one experience before in my life or in their life, right? So, like I can like, look at any pizza joint because I'm from New York and be like, look in there and see the quality of the pizza and think I am going to enjoy that place, even if I've never set foot in that restaurant before. And it's a very common experience in Los Angeles, right? So and I think that part of what drives this is these sort of long-term episodic memories of, in some cases, completely like individual experiences. They don't necessarily have to be entirely individual experiences. They can be memories of a sort of context, or of a context that links across many experiences across time, right? So like earlier, you were talking about the sort of general feeling that you got that sort of changed your approach to sociality, for instance, like that, and that somehow skips across time and skips across all of the negative episodes, but still binds together all of those positive episodes. That sort of thing can be understood to be driving decisions, and can be understood in a normative way, but from like a different normative tradition, not this utility maximizing tradition, but from an area of statistics called non-parametric estimation. And the point there is that, not to get too technical about it, but like rooting our theories in stuff in areas of research where we know that there are sort of provable guarantees that, if you follow this process, you will make a decision in the fewest number of samples, and so you'll make efficient decisions or something like that. That seems to be a good reference point for studying the brain, right? Because it's been adapted across millions of years. And it's been adapted towards something. And so why not take what we know is provably, highly adapted towards solving particular problems, and see how much, the brain and behavior match those kinds of problems. So that's the basic idea, right? So instead of saying that we repeatedly experience something over and over again and evaluate based on the utility, we could say, listen, what's the thing that I've done most recently or in my life that's most similar to the thing that I'm looking at in front of me, the pizza place, the Indian restaurant, the apple, the orange? And how did I like it that time? And what do I want to do based on what I did that time, or, however many times I think about? And that turns out to give you slightly different predictions about people's behavior, right? And the one that we sort of initially jumped off of was this idea that your decisions would be influenced by kind of incidental information in the environment, which like every advertiser discovered 2 centuries ago, right? But it's just not really accounted for in the standard kind of learning theory, and it turns out to be true in the lab as well. And so beginning from that, we could start to make assertions about the kinds of memories that people would choose to remember when they're making decisions. We could make hypotheses about that, and we could test those in the lab. And then as I moved into my postdoc, I met someone who's a visiting professor who is a clinician and a philosopher of science. His name is Hannah Pickard, and she, I remember very clearly, speaking of these sort of like, salient memories, right? I remember very clearly when she gave her kind of like introductory talk when she was visiting the institute I was working at. And she said, what we need is a cognitive theory of drug choice, right? So instantly they're using the phrase drug choice rather than addiction or substance use disorder. And she begins from this idea that all, substance use disorder or whatever you want to call it begins with the volitional choice to use drugs, because you're not addicted before you've actually tried it, right? And you're probably not addicted after the first time you've tried it. And so we should understand that volitional choice. And she says, listen, there's tons of reasons. I remember this slide very well. She's got a list of like 8 or 9 reasons why people use drugs. Drugs are great. They can help you with all these different things. She says the real question is not why these people are using drugs. It's not why they are sort of like, foisting off the negative consequences that they know about. But the real question is, why aren't all of us doing drugs all the time? And I just put my pen down and I was like, this is great. Totally, this person, we're going to work together. And we did. We had coffee, and then we started to sketch out sort of how some of the stuff that I had done matched onto some of her ideas, and that was the paper that you read. So I can stop there. I can go in any direction. I've talked
about. I might highlight something, well, at least what I took from your paper as like novel, is that you kind of like framed it. I think normally when people talk about addiction, they talk about it more as like very typical reinforcement learning or reward learning, kind of like the same like way people kind of view gambling. It's like one instance, like pulling the lever gave you a really positive reward, and so you could pull the lever like 100 more times, and it's almost like a habit. But like Aaron's paper points out that like if that was the case, like you wouldn't expect it to last, because like if you summed over all those events in time, it should weaken the first positive experience because there were so many like empty experiences afterwards. Right. So like, why does it stay so relevant? And so Aaron's like, well, it's not actually this summation that like the temporality of it doesn't always matter. Your memory can move through time to pick what the most important thing is, relative to the context that you're in, or so whatever's most relevant. And the context could be like a location or a situation that happened, maybe a social fight or something, or even a mental state. So if you like, maybe that anxiety that you were describing could be like a mental state that, I don't know, associates or predicts drug use or like some sort of behavior to fill it. Is that fair to describe the way you're?
Yeah, I think I can sum it up as, the problem with using learning models to talk about drug use is that they're learning, they're continuing to learn, right? And so if it is the case that you want to explain why people use drugs even though they don't seem to be doing well all that anymore, then a learning model is not going to be sufficient. And to be fair, like, it's not like I came up with this idea, right? I think Reddish, David Reddish, who's one of the early progenitors of this style of application to drug abuse, straight up said this about 13 years before I published this paper. But that comes from, and maybe this gets to the disease model, right? So the application of these theories to addiction comes from some early empirical observations that there were sort of malformed or maladaptive dopamine responses in people who are sort of long-term. I think it was methamphetamine, but I could be wrong, right? It was the sort of initial observation. And of course there are. I mean, if you're using methamphetamine or cocaine or whatever it was for a while, you're going to see changes in receptor occupancy because these are dopaminergic, like directly dopaminergic drugs, right?
So the evidence was for cocaine use, like damaged nucleus accumbens, like almost permanently, like single use.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's single use, right? That would
Wait, is this permanent?
To me. Yeah.
It's thought, I think like everything is sort of reversible in the brain, but yeah, like cocaine causes pretty strong damage to like the dendritic branching.
Well, I will say anecdotally, if you do meth for long enough, you're just on meth forever. Like that's how I've always
thought. Can you say more about
what
you mean by that?
Well, so I worked in rehabs
Mhm.
for a couple of years, I want to say, until like right before coronavirus.
Mhm.
I was a peer counselor, so like I basically, long story, but I kind of like skipped this program, was like hired as a peer counselor for this agency that sends you out to like nut houses and to fucking rehabs and all this shit. With both of which I've been in, although I they let me out of the nut house because they're like, oh, you just love drugs too much. Um, but uh but so I mean, a lot of guys I knew too, not a lot, but a fair amount of guys I knew too got into methamphetamine, whereas the rest of us got into dope. And there are a lot of people I've met and that I've known in my personal life, and but also observed in rehabs and stuff, where it's like they can cease the use of meth. They're not on meth anymore, but they are like, there is like a part of them that's always kind of on meth. Like they
Mm.
still mimic
Oh.
the physical movements and facial tics and speech styles that I associate with meth, and that I think anybody would fairly associate with meth. And also are very like, still have a sort of like minor tweaker brain thing still going on. And not everybody. I mean, I certainly know people who've stopped using meth and not. I mean, I'd stop using meth and I'm not like that. But I was also not as high frequency of a meth user as a lot of these people. I was using it as a seasoning to the heroin rather than I wouldn't do meth by itself. And so yeah, it's that always like when I stopped using meth, I was like, holy shit, I've probably done like irreversible damage to my brain, which is probably true to an extent. Although I don't know how I would quantify that, but that's something that actually still really bothers me because I mean, I'm also, quite a bit older than I now than when I started using and stopped using meth. But whenever I forget words or have like sometimes pretty basic words, or have like sort of I don't know, instances where my brain will just go completely blank, I always blame that on meth, whether fairly or unfairly.
I have those experiences and I have never used meth.
I think everybody does, but it's a meth provides me like a decent foil to blame it all on.
um, I cut you off earlier, Aaron, so I don't know if you wanted to finish your point, if you remember it. I kind of or
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a good way to segue into the stuff about disease, right?
Yes.
yeah.
So I'll just sort of finish up that line of thought, which is basically that. So it was pretty quickly discovered that if you take these learning models, sorry, I think maybe an important piece of background here. One of the reasons these learning models were applied to the study of drug abuse is that there was an observation in the late 90s that the way dopamine firing works seems to really match some of the predictions of these models in a really striking way. So there's this notion of a reward prediction error. So if I expect to receive a reward, and then I get less than I expected, then there'll be a negative reward prediction error. If I get more than I expected, there'll be a positive reward prediction error. And if I get exactly what I expected, then there's nothing. It's just sort of like a constant, right? And it turns out that firing in midbrain dopamine neurons seems to follow this pattern, right? So if you give monkeys some juice and they've fully expected that juice because you've always paired that amount of juice with a light, then you'll see a constant firing in their dopamine neurons. But if you give them a little bit more juice, there'll be sort of like an uptick. If you give them a little bit less juice, there'll be sort of a pause, right? And so this idea that the prediction error is tied with dopamine function made people think that maybe what these dopamine neurons are doing is computing reward prediction error, right? So not reward itself, but the prediction error, the difference between what you expect and what you received. So that got people to thinking about its relationship to addiction. And what they found was that in order to get things that look like these sort of like highly compulsive behaviors, you kind of need to modify the original theory a little bit. You need to add this extra boost that comes from the taking of the drug. So you say like, let's say I expect the drug to be, 5 units of good, and it turns out to be 5 units of good experientially. Well, there's another boost on top of that because a lot of these drugs actually directly lead to dopamine release, right? So like cocaine, for instance, and that allows you to sort of constantly be spiraling upwards. You're constantly adjusting your expectations upwards because you're getting this extra boost of dopamine, right? So that's the idea. Okay, so they write this down, they do some simulations, and they find that there's still some problems here. And one of those problems is something I don't think that we've talked about yet, but probably will resonate with you, which is that there's two things. One is that the way people approach drugs is not purely stimulus response, right? It's not like, oh, I'm not thinking about cocaine, suddenly it's directly in front of me, bam, I'm going to take it. People do really creative things to get drugs when they want them, right? It's much more about sort of like a motivated set of behaviors. And so that's difficult to explain in the sort of habit framework. The other thing is relapse, as we were talking about before, right? If I actually like actively don't like the drug and I don't have good experiences with it, or I go through recovery and I somehow devalue the drug, why is it that 3, 4, 5, 10 years later, suddenly I can find myself walking down the street and however it happens, have a relapse episode? So the theory was advanced, after that, and people just started adding things to it. And this is where I think we get into the problem with the disease model, right? So there is sort of like, can I do this among friends? Always already kind of like an othering involved in asserting that the diseased computation is different than the normal computation, right?
Yeah.
It's not exactly the same as saying someone, has a gene that's different, but it does sort of lend itself to thinking about things in like a brain circuits gone awry kind of way, which to me seems to sort of bake in the premise, right? It's very much question begging. And you sort of begin from the idea that there is a disease, that it's a coherent whole, and that it must be explainable in terms of a single computation or a set of computations gone awry. And this is why I think the memory sampling idea has some promise, because it's not just to explain disordered decisions. It can explain the whole array of decisions, including habitual and more flexible and more goal-directed decisions. And it's not to say that it's the only thing going on, but that it can sort of happen alongside other kinds of decision systems without presuming that people who are diseased are different in any way, or disordered, sorry, are different in any way other than they had a set of experiences that they keep thinking about.
Well, so my question, okay, wait, forgive me. I'll take the role. I'll play the role of the layman here.
Someone has to.
Wait, I thought the disease thing was like a metaphor. Are you telling me that people think that there's a disease where you're addicted to drinking or drugs?
Official statement of the National Institute of Drug Abuse that addiction is a brain disease.
Huh. Okay. Well, my whole
there
thing
are
with
reasons
that,
for this.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine. I mean, I've seen it sort of passed down or whatever from generations, and so that's always kind of what I assume. But I literally thought it was a metaphor. And like, obviously there are factors in people's brains wiring that, like brain wirings or whatever, that I'm sure contribute to like them becoming addicted to things.
Yeah.
Is that what it's referring to?
So part of my understanding, I wasn't around when this all happened. I came to the game a bit later than that. My understanding is that part of the motivation, actually Hannah, who I mentioned earlier, has a great paper about this coming out in a couple of months, is to address the stigma around substance use disorder. And the idea was that if you call it a brain disease, then you don't think of it as a choice, and therefore people are less responsible, and therefore they're not bad people, they're just people in need of help, right?
That's kind of what I figured too.
It turns out that actually there's stigma is multivalent, right? So like, yes, it actually does, provide that benefit that was discussed, but it also sort of increases this other idea. Actually, I took notes on this because this is really fascinating to me. John Kelly is a professor at Mass General. So if someone has a brain disease, they other people, including clinicians, by the way, were part of this like large nationwide survey. Their assessment of that person is decreased negativity, but increased sense of danger. An increased tendency towards social exclusion, not inviting them to things, keeping them out of things, while also having an increased perception of the possibility of recovery. You're just sort of like setting that off to the future. But if you say that someone has a drug problem, then their blame goes up, but they think of them as less dangerous and less likely to be socially excluded. Isn't that interesting? And also less likely to recover, and because it's something they're choosing to do, and it's something it's fascinating. and I think it kind of misses a lot of the points. But I'm mostly interested in sort of how it affects the science. We can talk about that.
Well, my confusion with it always was like, so for me, I am an addict in like, which I've known for longer than prior to being a drug addict. Like, I'm very impulsive. If something makes me feel good, even if it has negative consequences, I will do it until I can't do it anymore. And obviously, you know, I have a measure of self-control and I don't do that most of the time. But for instance, if I was minorly injured and a doctor gave me like, I mean, this is a drug thing, but I can't think of any other examples right now. A doctor gave me like 2 bottles of Vicodin or something. Even if I didn't, I would just take those like for until they ran out, even if I didn't feel injured. Or like if I like, I have to watch myself in a lot of behaviors I do, because I exhibit like I will, if something makes me feel nothing, or if it makes me feel minorly good at all, but if it makes me feel not bad, I will do it until I can't do it anymore. Unless I really watch myself, which I do. But my whole thing with heroin, and so my mother was a drug addict. My dad also was, but then stopped on his own and never did them again. It's like totally fine. So I don't know what you want to call that. But
That's pretty common.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I know a ton of people like that.
Yeah.
Although my dad did
something like 50% of people, you know, recover without any resources or services or whatever.
My dad did a lot of cocaine though, which is like the amount where I'm like, damn, you could have sent me to college. But he was totally like, he just stopped doing it one day and was totally fine. Like, he's told me about it. My mother, very different story. But my whole thing with heroin is, you know, I am an addict. So like, I was just kind of, there was, once I did it for the first time, I was like, this is it. Like, I'm going to do this forever. But I also know a lot of other people who become heroin addicts, because if you do heroin, it's addicting. Like, heroin, like, it's gonna get you, whether you have an addict gene or whatever or not. Like, if you do heroin enough, like, and not which isn't even that much, like, you know, if you spend like a month doing heroin, which, you know, obviously that sounds extreme, but people do cocaine for like a month, and, you know, it's I mean, it's seen as insane, but people do it. But, you know, if you do heroin enough, you're going to be a heroin addict. And so I think there's also like a social component of that. But I've also known people who were heroin addicts and stopped doing heroin just on their own and were totally fine after that, and like drank and everything, you know. But I think it differs from drug to drug. But I've never thought of it. It's funny because in AA it's talked about as a disease, but I still don't really necessarily think of it as a disease. I think of it as like a confluence of like social factors that get people into it, and, you know, and personal problems.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, you know, someone else who might have had the same or similar sets of, you know, access to or experiences with drugs that you did, but had something of a different structure in their life, may not have considered themselves an addict, and nor would they be considered an addict by the DSM or any other criteria that you use.
Yeah, which I am an officially diagnosed substance use disorder sufferer by a psychiatrist. So I am speaking from lived experience here.
Yeah. There are some interesting rat studies that you're making me think of. So like the classic idea was like they would do addiction models, especially with cocaine with rats, where like the rats learn to press the lever and they can self-administer cocaine. They would just keep doing it, right? And like the newer research kind of shows, well, like this is sort of an isolated, like a socially isolated rat with like very little to do, and it's just like self-stimulating with cocaine, potentially because like it's been deprived of like other stimulation. And so they have like examples, they use heroin in the study and meth, so it wasn't cocaine, but they teach the rat so that they could self-administer, but then they also teach them that they could administer social contact. So if they do something, they could hang out with another rat that they're friends with, and eventually they get a choice, and you'll see that they actually start increasing their preference for the social contact and decrease their addiction on both those drugs, and it's like the same rates.
So that's Marco Veneri, and he's in Yavin Shaham's lab, and he may have moved on.
But is it replicable?
This they replicated, I think, twice, and now they just put out their protocol in Nature to make, like, to give it
Right.
to other labs in extreme detail so that they can test this and do other variations.
I was just ripping you guys.
No,
Good to
I
know.
mean, that is a very important question. It's also like when we go back to like critiques of the 12 steps, the few studies I've seen of like psychiatry analyzing effectiveness of 12 steps are like not reproducible research, because like there's really huge dropout rates, there's bias in who signs up for the studies.
Yeah.
Like 12-step programs aren't necessarily participating in this. And then there's variation in different groups you might go to. So you're not really like controlling the environment each time.
Yeah. There's
but
huge
yeah.
variation.
Yeah. So, but there's mixed results. There is like a study that shows that that thinks that 12 steps meet like 5 out of 6 criteria for causation in terms of recovery. But then there's like, it was slammed by like Cochrane studies like in the 90s that was saying it was ineffective. So, and I think that's what like the social workers and psychiatrists look to now and think like 12 steps don't really help. But
It's funny though, like back to the point where you make in that early memories really guide later drug use, is like, that is such a, I mean, I just had like a flood of memories when we started talking about that, because that was, I mean, for a large part of my early recovery and like in rehabs and stuff, I had a really start and go kind of thing. Like I would get like a few months sober, you know, I got in some legal trouble and then try to get out. I got out of it by going to rehab, and that set off a whole, you know, I went to a lot of these programs. And a big thing I would hear from everybody and realize that was true for myself, although I hadn't been thinking of it like, I don't know. I was aware of it, but I hadn't really fully grasped my awareness of it, is that so much of drug use, of heroin use in particular, revolves around replicating early highs. Like that is why people keep doing it, because they think it'll be like how when they started, and it never is. Even when you like, if I was to go buy you know, some dope right now and do it, even though I've been off heroin for so long that, you know, I'm sure my body would respond in a somewhat similar way than when I first started using it, it still wouldn't be the same. And I think that honestly is, weirdly enough, reminds me of how people have like idealized versions of like the childhood, or like, you know, rosy thoughts about, you know, their elementary school, or, you know, what have you. And that leads a lot of people to do weird shit too. Although I think it's maybe less, I think that's maybe more elusive to actually quantify. But yeah, it was such a huge factor for so many people I know, was just like getting that early high, and that was something they really impressed onto us. It's like, you never, it's a I mean, they would actually say it's a progressive disease, but it's also progressive in the fact that like it's linear. You can't go back. Like once you're, you know, like once you've gone on that road for a while, like you can't go back around and start at the beginning. Like if I started using right now, it wouldn't be like when I first started using, when I was just hanging out in my apartment and like hanging out with friends and being social. I would immediately replicate the behaviors that I did for the later part of my using, which were pathetic and criminal. And so that's like, if I was to go get dope right now, okay, maybe I go for a walk and feel rosy in the neighborhood the first time, but probably not. I would probably be in my apartment filled with shame and insanity, and use in the same way that I used at the end of my addiction, even if I was like somewhat replicating the beginning of my addiction in terms of many drugs I was actually taking. More realistically, I'd probably overdose on fentanyl, because that's what everyone does when they actually relapse. But I don't know. That's just an interesting thing. Yeah, that's an interesting thing you had in the paper.
yeah. Yeah, that makes me want to ask you a question about cravings. Like, what is the experience of craving like? Because I think people kind of conceive of it as habit, and I don't know if it resonates well. But yeah, what does it feel like to have a craving?
So it's like, it literally I mean, have you guys ever craved anything?
Like chocolate.
Aaron, you've never craved anything?
All kinds of stuff. Yeah. Cheesecake.
Yeah. Yeah, but like, do you ever have
Sure.
like a
But I don't know if that, that word means the same thing in different contexts, I guess.
Yeah.
in my head, it sort of does. Like, it's just more intense. Like, I mean, I've had craving for like, I think the most common craving people have is for sweets, right? Like, I mean, that's usually what you hear. And sometimes you feel like a kind of like physical pull, like I need to go get a pint of ice cream or whatever, get a cheesecake. For me, cravings is a distinctly physical feeling in my stomach, where it's like, it's almost like it's a kind of silly image, but I mean, like, pulled by some, like, some gravity factors heavily into drug use, being pulled by some kind of like gravitational, I don't know, some heavy object towards that. Like, I remember very distinctly, I was once trying to go back to a sober home I was living in, and I was like, I can't relapse. I really want to relapse. And I was on the bus and I felt like this just insane compulsion, not insane. I felt this compulsion to get off the bus and go do that. And it was like, almost like I was watching myself do it. I mean, that's a really extreme example, like it was like, I was thinking at the same time, like, what am I doing? I'm about to throw away all this work I did. I'm about to fuck everything up. I'm not gonna have a place to sleep tonight. And as I was like, I remember this distinctly, like basically looking down and watching my feet walking up Leavenworth Street. And later, cravings just became like, I don't know, they're very associated with withdrawal for me. Like, I would feel like I felt sick, and I felt like I knew there was a cure and I could cure it. Yeah, but mentally, I would, you'd fantasize. I mean, it's been a really long time since I've actually had like real cravings, but you fantasize about it. Sometimes I would imagine the process of cooking up a shot, and like, it's obvious, lots of ink has been spilled about the rituals of that kind of thing and the addiction that people have towards that, which very true for me. And I would fantasize about that, and I would have to like stop myself. In fact, I learned a bunch of really silly, I think DBT, I can't remember which one, tricks to how to deal with that, which actually worked pretty good.
Can you tell me about them?
Yeah. I mean, one in particular was literally, it's flipping imagine a light switch flipping off in your head. That one is actually always my go-to, because if it didn't work just outright, it would work to make me think about what the fuck is wrong with my life, where I'm having to imagine a light switch flipping off so that I don't fantasize about shooting like heroin that's been in someone's asshole into my arm. And so that's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. But cravings are, I mean, that's what, like, in early sobriety, that's like your number one enemy is cravings. And there's a lot of time about triggers and stuff like that. And for me, like, the smell of coffee sometimes brewing is really similar to the smell of heroin, which funnily enough, I'd read about prior to being a junkie, and it was like, oh, that's weird. And then when I think I don't know exactly what process, but coffee shops sometimes have it. And that would really set me off at first. And I couldn't watch movies with people shooting up for like the first year, because I would get really, triggered by that. And especially I couldn't read books with it in it either, like with descriptions of it. Although I do now. I'm literally reading one right now. But
you'd say it's about a year that it took for that to stop. That's really
yeah. It was about I mean, they lessen over time too. They lessen, and you get tools to deal with it. Like, one thing you're supposed to do is tell somebody, and that kind of, honestly, that kind of makes it go away, because a lot of it's like crazy fantasies that you have, because there's not only the fantasy of being able to do the drug, there's the fantasy of like where that doesn't matter, like where that's okay to do, because you tell yourself like, I'll just do it once, and and then I'll go back and tell everybody. There'll be like a little vacation or something. Like, that's when I hear a lot. And when you tell that to somebody, and you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna go do heroin one time and then be sober again, anyone will be like, you sound like a moron. Like, And that's what I always say when people tell me about cravings. I'm like, or like not cravings, about fantasies that go along with the cravings of using.
Yeah.
I'm always like, you sound stupid. And everybody is always like, because you do. Like, it's objectively, you sound like an idiot being like, yeah, I can go smoke meth one time and then I'm all good. I'll just go to work tomorrow. It won't get, I'll never do it again. That's a fantasy. It's a bullshit fantasy. And so it can, when people tell you them, they want you to tell them that they're being not, you don't tell them that you're like an idiot, but you're like, that's a stupid fantasy, because that's what people know. That's why they're telling you that, to get it out of them, because it doesn't sound stupid when it's in your head.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that can play out even like in compulsions people have like after a breakup, where it's like, oh, I really want to reach out to this person.
Yes, 100%. Well, that's actually, you know what? That's a really good point. I think the behavior a lot of people have after traumatic breakups when they're younger, especially.
Yeah.
I remember trying to call when I was like 18 or 17, this girlfriend I had who broke up with me. I tried to call her like 50 times or something. I mean, I was like a fucking insane 17-year-old. She actually was also insane. So I don't.
So she probably liked.
No. That's not. Who knows? I think her phone was actually off. I was just trying to, when she was turning it on. But I remember that compulsion, which like is insane. It's insane to call someone 50 times. But I did it and I couldn't stop myself from doing it. And I think there's a lot of similarities, like behavior people have after breakups, and triggers and like all that stuff with addiction.
Yeah. It's funny. Do you think intelligence helps or hurts in these situations?
Neither.
Neither.
Dope is primarily an instinctual thing. Being smart is of no use. I mean, there's nothing. Dope is. I used to think that dinosaurs had two brains. They had one in their ass and they had one in their head. This apparently was a theory at one time in like the 50s, and for some reason I thought it was true until like I was 20, because someone had told it to me when I was a child. And of course, when I've told someone about it, I immediately, as I was talking, did you think it too, Aaron?
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, I'm not
within the last few years, because I think it's like a brontosaurus or something. Because this idea that they had one all the way at the other end.
They had like a cavity that they thought
made sense to me at 5.
Yeah,
I just sort of, because I've never worked with that. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. But the ass brain, like the tail brain, was supposed to be like govern instinct or something. And for me, heroin stuff is all tail brain. Like you don't have, you can't think your way out of it. And so, yeah. And you're never too smart to avoid.
But you can't, right? I mean, the CPT thing kind of.
Yes. Yeah. But even that's like, it's not like you're having a smart thought. Like you're having like I mean, it's almost the most basic thing. You're literally imagining not even words, just an image of a light switch.
Changing your mental state.
I would say that you're sorry. I was really quick. I would say that actually possibly a big part of what's going on there is simply just giving yourself a second more time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so getting back to my book here, right? I just kind of like, I want all of these to be explainable in terms of decision mechanisms that are prevalent in quote unquote normal humans, right? And this idea that like as you have more time to make a decision, you get online come the contributions of other decision systems or other memories or other sets of associations, and that ends up overcoming these sort of initial impulses.
Yeah, one of my favorite Al-Anon phrases is like, don't just do something, sit there, like just sit with the compulsion. Yeah, that helps a lot. My question about intelligence, though, I was wondering if we can go in the other direction. I don't even know if this is intelligence as much as just like overthinking behaviors, but I wonder if like the more complex thoughts you can generate could actually help you, could make you rationalize the bad decision in even more sophisticated ways, if that makes sense. Like you can come up with all these reasons why you should contact your ex because of whatever this, that like, maybe if you didn't have that complexity of information, you'd run out of options sooner. I don't know. Maybe it's like an
No,
anxiety
that's
thing.
I think that I mean I think it could go either way with that. I think you definitely I've seen that happen. Like
Yeah.
I've seen people like think themselves into a relapse. Like it's funny, a lot of AA stuff is actually like when I really didn't like AA for like the first couple, or even, yeah, I'd say first couple years I started going. And part of it was because I was like, they're trying to make you stupid.
Mm.
But like, first of all, AA, I mean, necessarily has to appeal to basically as many people as possible. So, it shouldn't be like this, like really smart thing. And I'm not even that smart of a guy. So it's like, if it was much smarter, it wouldn't even appeal to me. Um, but there's a lot of talk about like, don't think about this stuff, or like, like don't like sit there thinking about it. And I was like, that's stupid. Like you should think about everything. But like with a lot of, I think with addiction stuff is a lot, when you think about it, a lot of the times you either just like beat yourself up about stuff you feel guilty about, or you fantasize about when it was good,
Yeah.
your high period. And that's, I mean, that's same with me. And so like, that's basically my two things I think about was like stuff I feel really guilty about. And then stuff that rocked, like,
Yeah.
and it's funny because my memories are I have a really bad memory in general, like and I know, yes, I know everyone says that, but believe me, I have a bad memory. But I have vivid memories of when I first started getting high, like to the details in my room, like all that kind of stuff. And then for all of the bad shit, it's like kind of a blur. And the bad shit was a lot longer and a lot more recent. Granted, I was a lot higher too, so maybe a blur there also. But I don't know. It's we like studying this stuff. I was like, I don't know, how do you even quantify some of this shit? Like,
It's a great
Quantify
question.
overthinking. Yeah. I
or
mean, the animal models can't. Go ahead.
even just like especially with like the early memories of addiction, like how do you like how do you even figure that out if that has like an effect on people just
Yeah,
by
that's a great
asking them?
question.
Or
We're not there yet. So, one of the reasons I say that I'm not an addiction scientist, I have yet to work with substance use disorder patients of any kind, right? So what I've done is sort of like write down some theoretical ideas, and Hannah actually is a clinician and, has lots of experience, and she's like, this is what I think. And so we, melded these ideas and created something. But what we're doing in terms of experiments goes in a couple of directions. So we want to come up with some way to develop kind of a signature of the kinds of memories that we think are going to be constantly coming back, right? The gold standard would be to, have some kind of like headset on people or ecological momentary assessment app, and have them go out into the world, and then every now and then have them write down what is they're remembering, and then see if that actually ends up predicting drug use. That's hard and expensive, and I need to sort of build up a repertoire of findings before anybody will give me money to do that. But one of the directions we're going in is to build sort of a signature of the kinds of memories that we think are going to come back. And so this touches on another result that Marianne mentioned earlier, which is this idea that these reward prediction errors, they don't just affect learning, they don't just sort of change your expectations, but they also affect memories. So a paper we had, the first author was Nina Rouhani, who's now a postdoc, Caltech. She observed that people, when you just in a lab, when you give them just sort of a very simple experiment where they're like looking at photographs of scenes over and over again, and it's a different scene every time, and it's associated with different amounts of money between like 10 cents and 90 cents, that when the reward prediction errors were high, either high positive or high negative, people would have stronger memories for those pictures. Okay, so we did a follow-up study trying to ask why it is that this happened at a sort of mechanistic level. And what we found was that, people had higher memories for the pictures that were associated with strong prediction errors. But they also, we did a sequence memory experiment where we asked them, okay, let's say you saw an apple, then an orange, then a pear, and the orange had a prediction error associated with it. We asked them, how far is the apple from the pear? And it turns out it would be farther than other sets of images that were just one series apart, or one trial apart in the experiment. And and also that they would be closer to the orange. So both of them would be closer to the orange than other things that were otherwise consecutive. And so what we took from this is that what prediction errors are doing is they're sort of like creating this kind of what's called a context boundary. They're sort of telling you, listen, something has changed in the world, and everything that happened before leads to this, and everything that happens after comes from this, right? And it's kind of creating a kind of restructuring your memory in that way. And even at this, the level of like, the difference between 10 cents and 90 cents, right? So you can imagine when it's a surprising, highly salient, very vivid experience that involves lots of sensory and social cues, like for instance, the first time, you do drugs or get high or something like that, that can end up restructuring your memory in a really interesting way is the idea. And so we are beginning experiments that kind of move in this direction, trying to assess the prediction error quality of drug-related memories and drug-related cues.
This is I'm sorry. This goes back to something actually I asked you this, Aaron, in 2013, maybe. I remember this explicitly.
This one.
Well, because this was something important to me. Because I was thinking about my own life at the time. It was like, while I was applying to grad school, and I was thinking like 9/11 is a significant moment in my life. I actually do have PTSD from it technically or whatever, but I had been thinking about what it meant, and I called it like the 0 point, where I felt like every time I would think about a date, I would do it in reference to that. And I was asking you, I was like, do you have any 0 points in your life like that? And I think you said a graduation or something. But now that you say that with the prediction error, it makes so much sense. And it also leads into a question I had about like, a lot of this, like the theory that you've been discussing sounds a lot like theories of PTSD as well, but it's just like, negative coding instead of positive. And I would be curious on what both of you think about that. Sorry, go for it.
Oh, well, for me, I think that's actually, Aaron, what you said, actually what both of you said made a lot of sense to me. In terms of my own experience, like I do sort of section off my life. Obviously this isn't just about memory, but like the way I think of my life is like the big turning point in it. It was me becoming a junkie. Like everything, everything before that was sort of leading to that, and everything after that was leading away from that or through that, I guess, until the present. But that's like the big demarcation line, which is funny because when I first started using, nothing that spectacular happened. I just used Oxycontin for like a year. But I still like, that is sort of how I measure it in a way. And like, there's a sort of common phrase you hear, I don't even think it's an AA thing at all. It's just like something you hear in sobriety about how when you can kind of like, you stop sort of maturing once you start using drugs, which I always thought was really corny, but now I see there's obviously it's not true, literally true, but like it is true in a sense, especially with some people. And with me as well. Like I missed some really crucial years of development because I was taking OC80s and listening to television or whatever and like thinking I was Lou Reed. But yeah, I know that's I would say like it's like a vivid flashpoint of memory. Like there's a lot of memories associated with that particular time, and then after that they get fuzzier and fuzzier. Even before that, it's like fuzzier and fuzzier. But that is like a huge sort of cornucopia of memory.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I know we're coming to time, so maybe we can.
Sunday, I'm not doing anything.
I actually have to do we're doing an episode on Los Zetas tomorrow, and so I have to do a
research
bunch of
and stuff. Yeah.
By which I mean I'm going to go do some cocaine and like, oh man, these guys are really bringing in the good shit.
They're serious.
Yeah. But I can keep going for a little bit.
Okay. Are there final thoughts? If you guys have ideas on how it's related to PTSD, or if you think it is related at all.
So I have some like anecdotes about PTSD that I can try and work in here. So PTSD is definitely a disorder that people think of as a memory disorder, right? But not really. People have talked about addiction being related to episodic and long-term memory for quite some time, although it seems that those papers aren't as highly cited as the other papers, which is a really interesting set of conversations that we can have. where should I go with this? Okay, so I have two anecdotes related to PTSD treatment, and then we can sort of, back out how they might be related to how this might be used in addiction. So a thing that people are trying is using virtual reality to stamp out PTSD. And so they'll do things like, so as an example of something that's going on in San Diego at the VA, Iraq war veterans, they'll put them in VR and they'll be driving around, they'll see the statue of Saddam, they'll see everything. They run through the entire experience that they had up to the point where the IED goes off, and then it doesn't go off. And the idea here is that basically it's kind of like extinction, right? You kind of do the thing over and over and over again, and then eventually you don't have the experience anymore. Okay, so a friend of a friend was in Iraq and was in the backseat of a Humvee being driven from one green zone to somewhere else. And they were going down a highway, and suddenly the Marine who's driving the Humvee screeches to a halt, turns over the divider and jets back. And the person in the back says, "What happened?" And the Marine says, "I don't know, got to go back." So the person in the back, his name is Eric, waits a little while. He's a curious sort. They get back to the green zone, waits a little while, maybe an hour, goes up to the Marine again and says, "What happened?" And the Marine says, "There weren't any kids on the side of the road." And he didn't realize that consciously at the time, but it triggered something in him that said, "Listen, there's no kids on the side of the road. Somebody knows there's an IED, therefore we need to go back. Something bad's going to happen." Okay, so keep that in mind. A friend who's a philosopher of science was doing a study on the PTSD studies in San Diego, and she was driving with one of the people who had gone through treatment and had this extinction treatment. And they were driving in Los Angeles, and this person had been relatively cured, is the idea. And then suddenly they're driving, he's driving, she's in the car, he pulls over, they're on the highway, he says, "I got to get off right now." He pulls off the highway, and he having hyperventilating, all this sort of things, and she asks him what's up, and after a little while he says, there weren't enough people on the highway. Obviously, Los Angeles, there's always people on the highway, but there just weren't enough for him, and somehow that triggered something. And so the thing that I think that this gets at is something that I think is maybe not the worst possible outcome for PTSD extinction, but maybe very important for addiction, which is that if you use these kinds of treatments, you're not going to delete memories. What you are going to do is create this kind of like suppression, but you're not going to change all of the memories that were associated with that, all the semantic concepts that you have associated with that, right? These are not, suddenly you're not going to delete memories. You're going to maybe create islands of memories, which can then be triggered in different ways. And that might be perhaps more meaningful for addiction, where, in the case of alcohol, like you said, the triggers are everywhere. And that, I think, points to a different kind of treatment, like the stuff that we talk about in the paper, where you're sort of focused on not trying to suppress the memory, but really keep it active and then use it as an anchoring point to build on these kinds of behaviors that the person says they want to engage in. That's my thought on the relationship to PTSD.
That resonates. Go ahead, Brace.
I mean, I'm just thinking about how, like, I do know a lot of people who their experience with addiction basically also gave them PTSD. I mean, I think even in that Righteous Dope Fiend, I might be wrong. It's been a really long time since I read it. Like, I think they maybe talk about that in there at some point, but maybe it might be. I mean, because living on the street, especially, I mean, can give you that, but also just being a junkie, you see, I mean, I saw really gnarly shit. And which is, funny because like when you're high, you don't really feel anything about it. You're like, oh my God, like he should let that woman go. But like, you can't muster up any, but you're also like, maybe like this, I need to get dope from this guy. And so, I think it, like, some people have like, just anecdotally, like I have like almost a delayed reaction to that. Like they'll have seen a bunch of really gnarly fucked up shit when they are a junkie. And then when they get sober, they're like, oh my God, like what the fuck did I see there? Or like, what did I do? Even for a lot of people. I mean, for me, I did bad stuff. I didn't do anything that's like, I didn't like physically hurt anybody or like, like anything like that. But like I stole a lot, stole from people I loved. I broke into houses. Like, I was a like tier 1, or not, excuse me, like a tier 3, like junkie criminal. Like I wasn't very good at it, but I tried my best. And when I got sober, I was like, I don't know if you, I don't know what you would call this, because I still have guilt, like immense guilt that like guides a lot of my behavior, or at least looms over my life, and like I think about daily. That like I mean, it's not PTSD, but there is like a sort of I guess it's like lingering trauma there. But it's weird because I actually don't have like much trauma from other things in my life that I think would be called traumatic. But particularly only basically from like stuff I saw or did as like a dope fiend. And I see that a lot. And I think I think it makes the process of quitting dope harder for people, or, whatever substance harder for people, because I mean, this is something that sort of ties into the 12-step thing, is you get sober, and then you have to deal with like your trauma from what you did or what you saw when you were, and those memories can be really vivid, I think for people. And so
Would you
that is
characterize it as a kind of shame around your identity? It doesn't seem to match up with.
exactly. Yeah. And you're like, why do I deserve? I've heard this from a lot of people. It's like, I don't deserve to be sober. And there's survivor's guilt for a lot of people, especially, junkies now, because the fatality rate is, considerably, I think, higher now that with the fentanyl and everything. But yeah, it's funny because like my memories with junk are basically like extremely positive, rosy memories that are basically fake of when I first started, and then like weird flashes of like terrible things, or like, like the worst I've ever felt my entire life, or like seeing things that like I really should not have seen, and like, people dying, all that kind of stuff. um and it's funny because I can't really connect to those memories in a junkie way. Like those memories, of course, were only happened because of what I was doing, but I don't think of them as part of my drug use. I think of them as just like a traumatic incident in my life. Whereas I think of the like hanging out in my room and like cleaning up and feeling happy, off of whatever pills, that is part of my drug use, and I can connect to that. So like if I have cravings right now, I don't think of like I mean, there's a lot of shit I can name, but I don't think of like really dark shit in, tenderloin SROs. Even though that is like an actual memories I have that I think about, on not daily, but every so often. Especially like I still can't go to the tenderloin. Like I don't really like, I don't think I paid back a guy who I thought was going to really hurt me a little bit after I got sober. And he actually cried and hugged me, which I thought was really sweet. But I haven't actually really walked through the TL, maybe more. I maybe one time since and I've been sober for 7 years next week actually. And so I mean those memories are really strong for me, and funnily enough I first started getting high when I lived in the TL too, and so like I lived there for a long time. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with this, but the PTSD and drug use I think are like are often intermixed.
It's interesting. It's kind of similar to the way my dad like describes like ground zero, like he would not, like he could not go back there after like they were done with cleanup and rescue until like he tried once. I remember his description. He went with one of his closest friends and colleagues who was like there, with him. And they could not, well, at least my dad was like, I couldn't make it inside. He's like, there was a gift shop and children were running and laughing. And he's like, I just couldn't go in. But yeah, it's interesting because potentially you could, I don't know, by going back into the old situation, you could reawaken things, I think, especially with an addiction. With PTSD, though, the idea is that if you go back, you have this unique opportunity of queuing up the original memory and then changing some of your emotional associations with it. So if you go back and it's now safe, or at least, not not as negative, that you can
Yeah.
then like weaken some of the trigger responses you have.
That makes sense to me. I mean, that's like doing a same thing, but having like a positive result could like override that memory. I don't know. I don't know if that works, because I feel like, if I walk down the street in the TL and nothing happens, I won't even remember that,
Yeah. Yeah,
like,
exactly.
it's almost like too mundane to replicate. I mean, it's rather different than like an IED on, in a highway or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's also not PTSD either. It's just like
Right.
regular boring trauma. Um, and so yeah, it's I think a lot of that too is just working. I mean, I think, and not to be like an evangelist or whatever, but like I think the 12 steps do help you work through a lot of that. And a lot of it is guilt based too. And like, especially, having to call people, and like I think that's one of the most important things about like AA is like having to call people and apologize or pay them back, all that kind of stuff. I think that has like a really that almost overrides the memory for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Certainly did for me, because you actually have like, when rare very, considering what like how much uh emphasis is placed on like closure by a lot of people, you often don't really get it in life, but you can that's like, it is one of those rare instances where you can get some form of that, potentially, not always. I mean, I certainly have it from some of it,
Yeah.
but there is an opportunity for that, and I think that's really important for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm also just thinking now, like with guilt too, because I know like survivor's guilt, that's definitely something I know lingered with my father, where like I did this thing actually that I thought at the time, also 2013, Aaron, I think. The
Signal year
high
for you.
the high
Yeah.
line was, I think I processed a lot of bullshit around 9/11 around this time for me. But and I was also good at getting ready to leave New York for the first time. I was going to move for grad school. But the Highline was having a contest where you could like nominate anyone to like get busted, like, and they would make like a bust of them. And I nominated my dad.
I remember this.
You remember this? Yeah, I was
Yeah,
looking
yeah. I
back
thought it
on
was
this.
really sweet. Yeah.
I kind of like cringe a little bit looking back on it. So here's the rest of the story for you, Aaron. When I told my dad, and they had, I only told him after they accepted the nomination and put it on their website. He was mortified. It was really bad because I nominated him. I'm mentioning that he was a 9/11 firefighter, and he was just like I hadn't seen him that like solemn probably like since 9/11, in which he was just like, "Do you know how many other guys like?" What he just was, he was so embarrassed, and I understood in that moment why, but I totally didn't understand up until that moment. But yeah, and then we talked, I don't know if we ever talked about it, or if I just filled in the blanks of like what the kind of guilt that he carries for having not died.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I had a lot of friends that died, and then of course the serious stuff, I have some version of that as well. But yeah, that can, I don't even have it that bad. I know people who have it like really fucking bad, like, like, why didn't I die, blah blah. And I'm a big believer in dumb luck. That I think is my higher power. Is I believe in luck really really a lot. And so that sort of helped me justify it by being like, there is no justification, it's just how shit shakes out. But which, so because I'm lucky in that I don't really place I think that I do place a moral, and I think that there is, I don't actually don't know how to describe this. I don't know if I've ever actually enunciated this, but like I do think there is sort of like somewhat of like an honor in dying. Although when I say it, I don't mean it like that. I sound like a guy who like loves samurais, but like I think that it I don't even know where I'm going with that, but like I think that is like sort of how I process survivor's guilt, where it's like I'm like, it's these guys have some measure of like glory having died, even if it's just like a totally, ignominious or whatever death of like dying in a fucking bathroom stall or whatever. And I don't actually think that. It's just like, it's a weird way my brain automatically goes to justify it. And I guess maybe give them some measure of like, dying rather pathetic deaths. I mean, if we're gonna be totally honest, a lot of being a junkie is really pathetic. I think that's my way of like trying to sort of give them a little ego boost in the afterlife too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just I think a lot of the things, like from what I saw working in rehab, is like the trauma of being a junkie, and especially doubled with the trauma of being on the streets. That I think is like a huge, it's weird. I think it's like that is a big factor in why people go back out. Like is that they can't. I mean, that's even in Righteous Dope Fiend. I think they get the lady into a place at one point and then she goes out. Like I mean, it fucks with your brain in ways that like I don't even know how to describe.
There's another scene that kind of pairs with the one I mentioned earlier with Hank again, where he's constantly dealing with these abscesses.
Yes.
And he's, actively trying to burst one. And someone is like, you should see a doctor. And he's like, listen, I haven't had a shower in 30 days.
Yeah.
And he straight up says, like, there's just too much shame for me to go see a doctor.
100%.
And at that point, this idea of discounting is completely out the window, right? Like we're talking about something that could make him better right away, but there's this shame that's sort of driving the decision making that cannot be, accounted for.
That's the thing. It's like there's like I don't even know how you quantify that, right? Like there's like I know. I mean, for me,
it's a trump card at that point. It's just
exactly. It's like no, I'm not going to do the rational or even like second tier rational thing. I'm going to do an irrational thing that I know is irrational because of shame or what have you. I mean, I hit an abscess once when I was shooting up in the mission, and I was really lucky. My arm just did some rather grotesque swelling, and I stood outside of SF General for like an hour waiting for it to go down, knowing that I could lose my arm or die, and being like, I feel too ashamed to go in there.
Yeah.
And that was like it makes no sense. And I'm a fairly smart guy. I know what happens to you if all junkies kind of know what happened if you hit an artery. And even then I was still like, well, we'll see what happens. It makes you roll the dice. And I mean, yeah, it's that's what I'm saying. Intelligence is not a factor. You can be a dumb motherfucker and do way better than a smart guy if your instincts are different.
There's studies on colon cancer and cervical cancer that show that shame preventing people from getting colonoscopies and pap smears is like part of the reason why there's such a high death rate.
My dad's getting a colonoscopy like every week since I was like 10. So they're very normalized. I thought guys just got them all the time when they got older, but I mean, my dad, he's an old guy. So
yeah, there's like an episode of Dr. Phil where he gets one on live, like he like live streams it. And I thought it was so ridiculous until I read these studies or was like, wow, he actually did something significant to like help his viewer base.
Which is funny because Dr. Phil is evil as fuck. He's like a really bad guy.
I know nothing about him.
He always his whole thing is I got sent, at school I got sent to, Marianne. He sends people to those schools all the time like this. He has like kickback deals with them.
No.
Yeah. Also not a real doctor, I don't think.
Probably not. This was great. I really enjoyed this conversation. One thing I want to say, Brace, you called yourself not smart earlier, which is incredibly not true.
Thank you.
And then he called himself smart very recently. So
okay, good. So
exactly.
As he was describing standing outside the hospital with an
it's the Sigma variety podcast guest is where you constantly contradict yourself.
Thanks. I think I learned a lot.
This is great.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is helpful to you.
Please cure heroin addiction so that the prices go down.
2 years. And stop using fentanyl for everything.
Yeah. That's the thing that blows my mind is the fent in like it's like fentanyl came around right at the end of my drug use. I did fentanyl on purpose one time because it was always in lollipops. The only way you get it was in lollipops or was in patches where people would try to smoke the gel from the patches and die like every single time.
Oh my God.
Like literally like it would just kill you. But now I mean, the prevalence of it now is that's actually a big reason. Like, even if I was like close to the edge of relapse, I would have some reservations on that just because the way people die when they relapse is that they try to shoot or like do dope as much as they did, or even not as much as they did, just like they can't gauge it. They don't just start really small because I think they want to like, if they're going to do it, they want to do it. And now with like how unpredictable it is, it's like how you can't get dirt weed anymore. Like
Yeah.
it's like in Baltimore, I was reading like most of the heroin has fentanyl in it, like the vast majority of it does, which is just,
Damn.
I mean, if that's insane to me.
And cocaine now too. A lot of people OD. Yeah.
Yes, I think that is exaggerated a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, there was 3 guys in the Haight who OD'd by smoking meth with fentanyl in it, which is insane to me, because I'm like, just sell fake drugs. People do it all the time. Sell them bad meth. But yeah, no idea. Well, on that note,
tell me if you care about me, and if you care about yourself, and if you'll stop taking drugs, and if you'll stop being so hard, and if you'll stop being hard to talk to, and if you'll let me come inside.